Welcome to In Solidarity, a Seva Cooperative Federation podcast. Seva Cooperative Federation has been working for over 30 years to economically empower women in the informal sector through worker-owned cooperatives and collective enterprises. To put it quite simply, we work as a women's enterprise support system to promote and strengthen grassroots women's enterprises. Through this series of podcasts, we hope to cover themes that are of importance to informal women workers and their cooperatives and collective enterprises, and how we can create an enabling environment for women's enterprises to thrive.
अभी तो बहुत बड़ा सपना है हमारा।
मुझे कामनी बहुत जरूरत है, मैंने ले जाओ।
अब हम लोग के पास कैपिटल आ गया, अब हम लोग खुल के करेंगे बिजनेस।
સમયમાં તો જોવા જઈએ તો આપણે બધો કામમાં જ સમય જાય છે, પોતાના માટે સમય કાઢવો બહુ મુશ્કેલ હોય છે।
अभी हम लोग मतलब ये पैसा राउंड होते होते हम लोग 12-13 लाख का बिजनेस चल रहा है।
You've tuned in to In Solidarity, a Seva Cooperative Federation podcast. With India surpassing China to become the world's most populated country and one of the fastest growing economies in the world, why is the Indian women's workforce shrinking to abysmal lows? The number of Indian women in the workforce is among the 20 lowest in the world. And while the Indian economy has grown more than 10 times since 1990, its female workforce participation has fallen from 30% in 1990 to 19% as of 2021, according to World Bank data. Rinku Ben, an artisan at Abodana Handicraft Cooperative in Ahmedabad, says,
મારું નામ રિંકુ પ્રજાપતિ છે। હું આબોદાના મંડળીમાં આર્ટિઝન તરીકે કામ કરું છું। હું સવારે ઉઠું છું 7-8 વાગે।
I wake up around 7 a.m. and do the household chores. When my mother is not in town, I cook food for the family, pack lunch for my siblings, pack lunch for myself, and come to the cooperative at around 10 a.m. Here, I work as an artisan till about 6:37. Then I go home and cook. And if there is more stitching work at home, I do that too. It is not a secret that women, especially in the informal economy in both rural and urban India, are working all the time. Then what does a falling labor force participation rate mean? To better explain the gaps in data for women working in the informal economy, to give us an idea of what story the numbers are failing to tell and what we can do together to represent women's work better, we have with us today Rukmini S. Rukmini is an independent data journalist based in Chennai and has won numerous awards, including the Chameli Devi Jain Award for Outstanding Woman Journalist 2020, among several others. Her pandemic podcast, The Moving Curve, won an Emergent Ventures India Prize. And her first book, Whole Numbers and Half-Truths, What Data Can and Cannot Tell Us About Modern India, was published by Westland in 2021 and won the Tata Lit Live First Book Award for Non-Fiction. Her second book will be published at the end of 2023. Rukmini, I cannot tell you how delighted I am to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining me on this episode of In Solidarity.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm such a, I've admired Seva's work for so long, and I've done some reporting, field projects of Seva. When I was even doing field reporting around women's work, I went through Seva to a community that I was looking at in Delhi at the time. So I've known and admired Seva's work for so long that it's my privilege to be on the show.
Well, I'm a fan, and I'm delighted that I get to have this opportunity to have this conversation with you. Rukmini, as a data journalist, you spent a lot of time understanding large sets of data and what it says about India, right? I'm particularly interested in women's work. What are the current gaps, according to you, in designing government surveys or in data collection on women's work particularly, and how has it evolved over the years?
So I think one of the first things to sort of understand and think about women's work is that in an ideal world, it is meant to be captured in broad data around employment and unemployment. So the key source for data around employment tends to come from the National Sample Survey, which is conducted as a nationally representative survey at regular intervals across the country. And the idea really is that the reason we do it the reason we rely on household surveying for this and not things like EPFO or other administrative data is because of the sense that an enumerator, a trained enumerator, can tease out aspects of how women are working or being, part of the productive economy, even if they may or may not see it that way themselves. So that's the first point, that women's work is meant to be captured within the official statistical system. Now, there are some problems with the official data that extend far beyond women's work alone. There are problems with how we capture employment. And one of the big points in this is that the frequency is just not good enough. We don't have high frequency data around employment. So when things like the pandemic happen and you know that there's been a huge employment shock, official data is simply not able to capture it fast enough. Now that's changed a little bit because this official employment survey has now become quarterly, which is a huge improvement from how it used to be. But of course, we could always use much more high frequency and much more, quickly available data. I think the second thing is actually not about the data itself, but about the interpretation and sort of narratives around the data. And I think there's been a particularly sort of dangerous narrative that's taken hold in the last couple of years around official data, particularly on employment, which is that this is, an old-fashioned fuddy-duddy system that simply cannot capture the ways we all work now, which is so flexible. It doesn't capture your, gig economy. And while it's tempting to think that when you see the output in a PDF, that all of which harks back to something that feels very old-fashioned, the way the questions are actually designed and asked are meant to capture people in flexible work, in work that is informal. It is not an official system meant to capture only official labor, only people working within the, formal economy. So potentially it could be capturing all sorts of work. The questions asked are about the way people have spent most of either the previous year or the previous week or the previous day itself. So it is meant to capture many bits of work. Again, official data is meant to capture both principal activity as well as subsidiary activity. So it means that even if you are spending most of your day as a person running a vegetable shop, but in the morning you do a milk round, so that is also an activity you do. It is meant to capture all of that. None of which is to say that official data captures all women's work perfectly. We do know that there are issues with falling female labor force employment and labor force participation, and we could talk about that in a bit. But there is work by feminist economists that does show that some of women's work is not accurately captured, and this could have a number of reasons. It could range from enumerators not doing a good enough job of teasing this answer out. So a woman might see work that she does on her husband's enterprise, which does feed into the productive economy and feeds into making money for the family, but she may not see her labor as remunerative. So this could come from enumerators not teasing it out well enough. It could also come from the fact that women's work is broken up and seasonal and piecemeal to a much larger extent than men's work is. So while the labor statistics are meant to capture even temporary or sort of short-term work, if they're not doing a good enough job of that, they will miss a lot more of women's work. Other questions around whether, since a lot of women's work again tends to be around household but productive activities, so things like cattle rearing or artisanal household products, is that being accurately captured if it is being largely used for household consumption? So those are some of the, I think, broad things that are missed. And the good part of this conversation really taking hold in the last couple of years, again led by feminist economists, means that there is a lot of thinking and innovation going on about how people can do a better job of it. There's thinking around whether privately conducted surveys may do a better job. There's an increasing emphasis on, could we ask more questions around women's work in particular and attach them to other surveys that are being done? So at least there's an acknowledgement that there are deficiencies in the data and a sort of energy to get more out of surveys and out of data.
I mean, that's really interesting to know because I think one of the things that we end up doing is assume that it's only formal work that is being captured, right? Especially because so many women that we work with, even in the informal economy, are home based workers. And very often don't think of themselves as workers. So, like you're saying, they do the work, but the money comes in the hands of the man. So, recognizing themselves as workers is often the first step before somebody else recognizes, or a survey
Right,
can kind of.
absolutely. I think the question about women themselves not seeing themselves as workers is really key. And that is certainly an area where we could imagine that official statistics miss women's work. It's entirely possible that an enumerator is not able to get, even though what they're meant to ask is about what the person did in the previous year. But yes, there's a good case to be made for specific training to be able to tease out that sort of work. And that's where things like a time use survey can come in, where perhaps even if a woman simply narrates what she did in the previous day, and then that is coded into paid work or not, could be an interesting way to do it as well.
So this brings me to the next question, which is what do these surveys define as women's work? And I think you answered that to some extent in your last question. But how does women's work get defined?
Here, of course, I do like to sort of bring in the fact that the pedigree of the Indian statistical system is something that's important to convey more widely, because some of these questions which we feel would simply get missed and perhaps aren't being looked at, it is important to think, to understand that these surveys have been conducted in the same sort of manner for nearly 70 years, and questions and debates around these particular issues are very common and have happened for decades. It's in the pages of the EPW, in the pages of in op-eds, in academia, both overseas and in India. There has been a lot of debate about these definitions and what is coming out of the data. So I think there's good reason to start with some faith in the statistical system, in its ability to be able to capture this. However, it does mean that there is a lot that you're putting on in the hands of enumerators to be able to tease out from people whether they are being paid in some form for their work, whether they are being paid in kind, whether it is contributing to somebody else's productive work. It does place a lot of that in the hands of the enumerator. And I think some work by the sociologist and demographer Sonali Desai has shown, for example, that when the NSSO, because the NSSO moved over the years to part-time enumerators, she has raised the question of whether this could potentially have had an impact on the quality of data, including on women's work that's being gathered. So that's where I think triangulating with other data sources, particularly with other large national surveys conducted on the field at similar times, becomes valuable. So, Sonali Desai herself leads the India Human Development Survey conducted by the NCER and the University of Maryland. And because in the past it has been conducted around the same time that an NSSO employment survey was in the field as well, it becomes possible to compare these things. I think the IHDS found slightly higher rates of female workforce participation than the NSSO did. Though it doesn't change the entire story, but it did mean higher numbers. And she did raise the question of whether we should worry that some of what is being missed is actually enumerators with less training over time going out into the field. So it's a hard one, figuring out what economic activity is, conveying it to the person you are interviewing. And it does mean that we need very good field enumerators.
You often talk about data telling a story, and I'm curious about what story, just based on data that you've worked with over several years, what does the story look like around women and women's work?
So I think when it comes to women's work, the sort of narrative tended to be that female labor force participation is low and at times declines because of improvements in household income. That used to be a very strong narrative, that when families get richer, they pull women out of paid work because of what is seen as family pride. So there was certainly a strong section of looking at this that saw declines in female labor force participation as positive signs for the economy, as the sign of an economy that's doing well and pulling women back. I think that sort of narrative has really taken a beating in a good way. I really think that has been the sort of flaws in that reasoning have been really shown up because we are seeing female labor force participation dropping significantly in rural India, dropping significantly among the poor, dropping in times of need and distress. All of which makes it, apparent that there are multiple forces at play over here. So I think the story of women's work is in some ways at the intersection of sociology and economy in a way. That now there is an acceptance that sociological factors are at play, and simultaneous an acceptance that we are in a situation where jobs are tight. And what does that mean then for jobs for women? And it really shows you that these two sort of forces are enmeshed with each other because the choice of who gets those jobs is not value free. It does mean that prioritizing men getting jobs in an era of scarcity is driven by gender based norms as well. So I think we're sort of seeing this as the intersection of two forces. More broadly, for women, I think one of the things I do think that there have been some of the most positive sort of long range success stories across the board in India are when it comes to women. So I think in the chapter in the book that I look at on political empowerment, the enormous increase in female voter turnout, which is really sort of without precedent in Indian history and really a significant trend anywhere in the world, is really one of the big sort of success stories of political empowerment. I think we similarly see this in education, not just the similarities in primary and enrollment rates, but what we're beginning to see in higher education, including rates of graduation, is really again an enormous success story. So I think what we're likely to continue seeing is this sort of leveling up in indicators for men and women. I think what we're not simultaneously seeing is a leveling up in indicators across social groups. So we're not seeing this leveling up between caste groups and we're not seeing this leveling up between religious groups. So, seeing it as purely as gains for women becomes meaningless if we don't see it in terms of gains for which women.
I'm going to bring you back to the labor force participation data, and I'm just going to use something that we found in your book itself. So India's female labor force participation has been falling steadily over time. And I think in 2017, 2018, it fell to a historic low of about 23.3%. Like you said, the entire decline seems to be driven by the rural economy, where the participation has dropped roughly from 32% to 18% in the same period. Our work with women in the rural economy tells us that women in the rural economy are always working. So what is this gap and what does this number mean then?
Yeah, so I really, think it's a great way you phrased it, and perhaps almost every discussion on female work should be prefaced with the statement that women in India are always working. This is, important to see, and it encapsulates so much. It encapsulates in some ways this binary that we make between paid and unpaid work, and sort of make one seem like work while one is not. While all work is work, and some work most of the work that's not paid is backbreaking work. So it's giving it its due respect really should be the way we preface all of these conversations. So this decline in female labor force participation, particularly in rural India, I do think again has to be seen at this point of intersection between sociological and economic forces. What we do know is around the time in 17, 18, 19 that there was worsening rural distress, a slowing down of household income growths, and simultaneously a huge squeeze on jobs. So what we saw around the same time, particularly in 17, 18 and data which was made available in 19, was that unemployment had also had risen to a historic high. So it was an overall job squeeze, an overall worsening of rural distress, and tightening of household incomes. And then, in that context, who gets the scarce jobs that are available becomes a sociological question, one that in India does seem to be answered by, well, the men first. So it seems intuitive now to see this decline in female labor force participation in the context of a worsening rural economy. I think what was happening around the time as well was we do see this regularly that the rural non-farm economy just hasn't grown in the way that many would have hoped or perhaps even would have been predicted. So, what are those jobs going to be, particularly for rural women, if they are not in agriculture, since we continue to see this sort of declining growths in agriculture, declining margins in agriculture? That part has remained extremely unclear. So to my mind, that's really where I would see what was happening with women's work.
How can we begin to tell this story better? What is the role perhaps of women's organizations like our own women's collectives in telling this story along with data? How can we do this better so that women are better represented, women's work is more visible? How do you understand this? And
So I do think that almost all of our understanding of how women work in the paid economy comes as a result of women's organizations like Seva. And this is where I was mentioning reporting on a community of workers. I think these were scrap cloth collectors in a part of Delhi, and it's the sort of field experience that I would want all journalists to have, or everyone writing, thinking, talking about women's work to have. Women's organizations have already done a tremendous job in making visible exactly how it is that women work and what could be possibly being missed. I think they've also done a great job of feeding into the work of feminist economists, and then pushing for things like the Time Use Survey, which was first conducted in the 90s in India and then was conducted in the late 2010s, really largely as a result of feminist economists making the case that we need to understand how women spend their day and the amount of work they're doing. We need to understand that much better. One of the most telling statistics that comes out of that has just remained seared on my brain is the fact that a woman in a paid job does more hours of unpaid household work than an unemployed man. Now, it just has so many stories within it at one go, and this is the sort of granular understanding as a result of having something like the Time Use Survey that really should be more sort of widely available. So there's sort of 3 or 4 ways in which I feel that women's organizations could continue to push this conversation forward. One is through storytelling, because this sort of understanding of how a woman spends her day, how she sees herself as a worker, how her work is sort of dispersed, continues to feed into our understanding of what we're seeing in official statistics and giving us a sense of what we could be missing, which could lead to either other surveys or qualitative surveys. Perhaps we could have a day when the NSSO conducts a women's work round. We could have that, where the entire focus is on women's work alone. So that sort of storytelling from the ground should continue to happen. The other thing that I do think is important, though, and I'm sure women's organizations also struggle with it, which is there is often a lot of field level data that is collected. Some of it is quantitative, some of it is qualitative, that comes out of perhaps doing a smaller survey with your own community, and then maybe writing about it or doing a report about it and trying to understand how to get that out more broadly or how to get it to feed into policy. And I think when I was particularly in newsrooms, I'd often have this problem where an organization would have conducted this survey that doesn't in many ways meet the statistical standards that make it generalizable. It's valuable for them, but perhaps not generalizable. And then I suppose pretty justified or fair frustration on the part of the organization as well, that their message or their data collection was not being taken further. While I do see these sorts of surveys or data collection as valuable for organizations for themselves, I do think that we need to be a bit more circumspect about thinking about their broader use and their generalizability. The issue of bias in data collection is applies across the board from governments downwards to all of us. And so organizations that already have a clear stand, which doesn't make it a good stand or a bad stand, it is their stand, then conducting field level or household surveys in their community that usually produce findings that continue to support their own positions could be an important tool for advocacy, but doesn't become something that's usable in a generalizable or in a sort of data context. So I think that becomes sometimes a sort of fault line or a conflict between even journalists and organizations, and both of us understanding each other's perspectives would help figure out what can be done with that information. I think one of the things I've done quite a lot of in the last couple of years is, try to keep beliefs, ideology, priors, biases for myself and not for broader writing and for reporting. And, forget for any other reason or for any sort of textbook journalistic notion of neutrality, leave all of that aside. It's just that I find that it stops you from asking truly interesting questions of the data when you've already decided what you want to find in it. I do believe that women's organizations should continue to surface the stories of women that will help with broader data collection. Perhaps they should, the surveys that they conduct in their communities continue to be important, particularly for advocacy. But their broader use might be something that would be harder to take up.
And I think sort of adjacent to this question is, since government is using a lot of this data for programming and and informs current debate and policies, right, around redistribution, poverty alleviation, what are the threats for any kind of marginalized groups that you see?
So there's a couple of levels of this. One is a sort of very justified and important concern that people have about security and privacy in a data context. The very act of being counted and being measured. And I think this is something that perhaps I have not paid enough attention to in the past. It is, of course, a product of privilege, and I do think that it's important to continue to talk about it. The very sort of real dangers that are posed to marginalized communities by the very act of being counted. We have seen this in the past, and we'll continue to see it in even more sharp dimensions in the future, including when it comes to questions around identity, citizenship, origin stories, that sort of thing. So that's one part of it. But even if we're talking about anonymized, household survey sort of data that is meant to feed into programming, I think then the role of oversight and debate becomes essential. So one of the things that's been happening for the last 6 months or so is a sort of very strong debate about India's poverty numbers. And the reason there is this debate is because we haven't had official data around household consumption since 2011-12. We haven't had it in more than 10 years. So in that vacuum, each group of people, is free to sort of use their own sets of assumptions and then produce estimates. I don't think this on its own is a problem. I do think that this sort of work should happen. So what's ended up happening is a lot of back and forth, arguments for and against. In op-ed, someone writes something, you can expect 1 week down the line, someone trying to do a takedown of it. And there can sometimes be fatigue or ennui around it, that how long are we going to go on arguing about these things? But when you phrase it as you did just now in the context of it's the use of this data for programming, for interventions, for schemes, then it's a sort of reminder of how important this continues to be and how important oversight and debate is. And, the fact that we should be sort of welcoming that there are people willing to continue engaging in this sort of back and forth rather than just feeling the fatigue that many of us do around it. That's one part of it. And I do think that pushing back against misinterpretations and sort of narrative building around the data does become very important. I do think that there was almost a sort of time in which it seemed like employment data was really being diminished by criticism. The criticism wasn't meant to raise it up or improve it. The criticism was to try and say that this is useless. And with that, we would have ended up throwing out almost all of our understanding of women's work as well, because, as we discussed and as you mentioned, even in the communities that you work with, most of the women are in informal work. So price being constant vigilance is the bottom line to it, that this data remains very real in the lives of people who depend for a large variety of things on the state, and supporting groups and institutions and arms that have oversight functions remains very important. It remains important to push back against the diminishment of the RTI when you see the huge use that it has been put to by civil society organizations to do this sort of oversight role. In some ways, I can't even imagine what we would have had of the Narega Act if the use of RTI to make, all of this conversation around muster rolls and all of this administrative data publicly available if that hadn't happened. So, as you said, it remains important to re-emphasize how valuable and how essential this data is in people's lives, and then continue to sort of strengthen the hand of people who seek to build oversight mechanisms. This is really not about picking sides. It is that having oversight remains an important function, and making sure that this data, it's people's data, making sure that it remains available to people, isn't put behind portals that they don't have access to. Pushing for more and more of making that available also is something that I would strongly support.
So I think there's no doubt that this data is important. But I guess the real question is in the interpretation of it. Or what is the role then of media in helping people like me decode and understand what this data actually means?
No, absolutely. I hear this a lot from people now, where you feel that, maybe there was a time a couple of years ago where the push was, okay, if you're going to make a statement, then show me the data. And now it is more a question of, well, everybody's showing you some data, so what do you believe? It's not that they're making statements without data; they are claiming to show something for it. So the three steps that I really hope to institutionalize in some ways going forward is: one, data access; two, clear explanation of methodologies, including flaws with the data, and it's not an acceptance of weakness of some sort to accept that the data that you're talking about may not be telling a full picture. It's just what reality is. There's no point giving this sort of false hope of 100% clarity when it doesn't exist from the data. So there's access to the data, there's explaining of methodology, and there's non-partisan writing. These are really three sort of pillars which I'm working towards figuring out ways of institutionalizing them going forward.
This brings me to my last question. Tell us a little bit about your journey personally as a data journalist. What brought you to it? What have your main learnings been? And tell us a little bit about your book as well.
So I am an accidental data journalist. I am an intentional journalist, but not an intentional data journalist. I didn't study math, stats, economics, politics, any of this at all. I was a field reporter, and after having done that for a while, this was the time where many of us in Indian newsrooms were beginning to feel that we wanted to write more about people from marginalized communities, from poorer parts of the country. And the broad word used at the time was development journalism then. Now, I think the good thing that's happened in the last 10 years is that there's been such an explosion of development journalism that it isn't its own category anymore. Most of what you read on, say, a scroll or in Pari is development journalism. It doesn't need to be called that anymore. And even in the pages of an Indian Express or the Hindu, you'll see a lot of that sort of just covering the country in all of its diversity. So because I wanted to do that, I decided to do a master's in development studies. And since I hadn't studied any of this before, it was the first time I came across quantitative research around India. I had just not seen any of this before. So when I returned to India and wanted to come back to journalism, I felt that I wanted to incorporate this new research that I now knew about in my writing. And so that sort of ended up turning into data journalism really on the job. I was lucky to have very good bosses right from the beginning who sort of taught me really how to look at Indian numbers, and I learned in that way on the job. I moved out of mainstream newsrooms in 2018 and worked independently for a while after that. And then I think one of the things that happened following the book, so in 2021, I wrote a book, Whole Numbers and Half Truths, What Data Can and Cannot Tell You About Modern India. And the idea was to try and bring together both my sense of what good data could tell us about India, because I often felt that I was discovering these exciting things in numbers and, people didn't know about it. I wanted to share that, as well as what my experiences on the field and conversations with experts had shown me that the data missed or got wrong. So I didn't want to give that sort of false notion of certainty. I did feel like reality was messy and I wanted to communicate that messiness. Sort of the direction of my work has changed in the aftermath of the book, because I think a lot of the conversations after the book came out have been in some ways reflecting the thought that you had in your previous question, which is around how do we access accurate information, how can we trust things. So I'm just sort of working towards something that I hope can sort of bridge that gap, both in terms of access to the data as well as in terms of accessing easy to understand non-partisan writing. And I'm also working on a second book, which again feeds into ideas of this. It's around misinformation. And the idea is to try and give people handy statistical tools that will help them pierce through this fog of misinformation that everybody seems to be enveloped in right now. So that's the direction that my post-book journey has taken me into.
Wow, superb. I'm really looking forward to the second book.
Thank you. It's called How to Talk to Your WhatsApp Uncle.
Superb. Thank you so much, Rukmini, for having this amazing conversation with me. I think there's so much I got to learn, about how to see data, how to understand it. Because very often we have this idea, like I said, that data is very biased or the way it's collected is very biased. But it's very important to know that there's both sides to it and it's really about how you interpret it. So thank you so much for that. And really looking forward to all the wonderful
My
things
pleasure, really my pleasure.
If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, do share it with your friends and family. If you would like to collaborate or partner with us or get in touch with our women's cooperatives, write to us at communications@sevafederation.org. That is communications@SEWAFEDERATION.org. We'll be back with another guest and another episode. Until then, stay tuned to In Solidarity.